secondly by Mr. Wagner. And I apologize for the delay. We've had some speeches in the House that have precipitated this delay, and so we're going to start now. Go ahead, Mr. Susla, please.
Thank you. I've been asked here today to speak to my experience with misinformation from the Correctional Service of Canada. I am and have been a correctional officer with the CSC since 2007. This opportunity gives me a chance to address issues I've experienced and observed and are experienced by correctional officers all over the country who are not able to speak or to draw attention to these issues because of fear of retribution and punishment. It is widely known amongst correctional officers that the message of the state of our penitentiaries as represented by the Correctional Service of Canada is a very inaccurate representation of what is happening in our prisons. Violence in our prisons is one of the most pressing issues faced by correctional officers. The levels of violence within a prison is at a level I've never seen in my career. The violence against correctional officers is at a level I never would have assumed it could or would ever be allowed to get to. I classify this as a measure of misinformation because the issue is so discarded by the service. Officers are often ridiculed by management for reporting assaults and are often coerced to not document or to write reports regarding these assaults. Correctional officers understand that working in Canada's federal prisons come with inherent risks, but the injuries they incur are widely discredited through many means, not the least of which is the General Correctional Service of Canada refusal to allow assaults and threats against correctional officers to be documented and reported through occupational health and safety procedures. Incidents that are documented seldom result in any change in routine or procedure that would alter the likelihood of these happening again. Correctional officers struggle against the service while trying to recover from injuries sustained at work. They are pressured to suck it up, to grow up, to not report, and to not miss work after an injury or an incident. It is a general cliche that rings true within prison that someone has to die before a safety concern regarding protection from inmates is actioned. Life-threatening incidents and murders are the generally accepted threshold for taking a situation seriously. But why do I classify this as misinformation? Because a picture is painted by the CSC that does not take this reality into account, and by doing so, further belittles the struggles of those on the front line in prison. Initiatives like the Needle Exchange Program is an easy example of a response to a very inaccurately presented problem within prisons. Canada's prisons are filled with drugs. Correctional officers across the country will unanimously agree that the only change is the amount of narcotics in prison year after year is the increase. Substances that were seldomly seen are now so prevalent that they draw little to no attention when confiscated. Officers have become proficient in administering naloxone to overdosing inmates, sometimes multiple times a shift. Needles within Canada prisons have always been a rare piece of contraband to find. They were generally crudely made and ineffective. Probably for this reason, drugs within prison are very seldom used intravenously. In prison, drugs are smoked or snorted. The introduction of the Prison Needle Exchange Program has and is introducing an injection drug problem that did not exist in our prisons. The service's rhetoric that this is a harm reduction measure is actually creating a new problem that we on the front lines have never had to deal with. Besides the introduction of injecting drugs in prison, we are also presenting weapons to a violent inmate population and creating an economy for these needles to be used and distributed through the populations. The use of medium and maximum security inmates unsupervised outside of a perimeter fence, and the terms used to get around policies that would not allow these to happen are standard practice. Terms like perimeter work clearance and on-site TAs or temporary absences or positions of trust are terms often used at sites for inmates who are not eligible for forms of release into the community or away from security measures. Inmates in these positions often introduce contraband into the institution, most commonly in the forms of drugs and cell phones. Memos are often written directing officers to not perform regular search procedures on these inmates once they return to the institution because of their positions of trust or exempt status. Inmates on perimeter exception are constantly using these opportunities to visit community restaurants, coffee shops like Starbucks, etc., and of course to introduce contraband and participate in other security compromising activities, including escapes. It is demoralizing and insulting to frontline correctional officers to see the organization they work for misrepresent their workplace and the dangers they face and further contribute to those dangers by not properly responding to issues, fostering a culture that does not allow accurate reporting, and minimizing the physical and mental injuries often incurred in this environment. That's my opening statement.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Suzla. I'm going to go to Mr. Wagner. Mr. Wagner, you have up to 5 minutes to address the committee. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you and good afternoon. I'm happy to offer some general thoughts about misinformation and misinformation correction before answering your questions to the best of my knowledge and experience. My name is Michael W. Wagner. I have a PhD in political science from Indiana University. I'm the William T. Evu Distinguished Chair for the Wisconsin Idea and a professor in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication, where I direct the Center for Communication and Civic Renewal at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's well established that Russia's Internet Research Agency, or IRA, operated thousands of Twitter accounts posing as individuals to weigh in on U.S. and Canadian political discussions on social media, both in the United States and other countries, including Canada. Beyond driving some social media conversations witnessed by and engaged with by users of social media platforms like Twitter, now called X, these IRA accounts also found their way into legitimate news coverage, being quoted as examples of the person on the street, further amplifying IRA messages about issues like Russia's support for Russia's war with Ukraine. This greatly amplifies the reach of their messages as far as more people consume legitimate news sources than use social media to learn about and discuss politics. It also increases the likelihood that lawmakers could be affected by IRA posts, as research also demonstrates that parliamentarians use legitimate news sources as a way to read public opinion, something lawmakers can then choose to use in their own decision-making calculus about how to represent their constituents. In terms of another aspect of misinformation online, it's useful to think about what factors are most associated with inaccurate content going viral, that is, being spread widely and quickly. Posts with more emotional resonance are more likely to get shared online. Posts published at times people are habitually more likely to be on social media matters to make things go viral as well. Perhaps most importantly, key influencers in politics and the news media sharing or spreading that information are often critical amplifiers to virality. In terms of misinformation correction, fact checks can work to help people come to believe things that are verifiably true. Labeling stories as a fact check tends to motivate audiences to think about the accuracy of information while they're consuming it. People who are willing to admit what they don't know are also more likely to benefit from fact checks. But fact checks come at a cost, the cost of people believing the fact checkers are biased, which could affect long-term trusting relationships the audience has with more legitimate news sources. Another promising strategy to correct misinformation on social media is the use of a strategy called observed correction. Rather than engaging with the person making a mis or disinformation claim, simply correcting the claim without focusing on the person and linking to the accurate information is useful. Research shows that observational correction occurs when seeing misinformation shared by others being debunked on social media. It reduces misperceptions or beliefs in misinformation among the audiences witnessing the exchange, even if it doesn't affect the opinion of the person who created the false post to begin with. The strategy is shown to be more effective in some circumstances than pre-bunking misinformation, and there's some evidence that logic-based interventions perform better than fact-based interventions as well. I'm happy to answer questions about these factors or other factors related to misinformation and the health of democracies. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you both for being under time. That'll allow for more questions. We're going to start, we have 6-minute rounds starting with each party. I'm going to begin with Mr. Caputo. Mr. Caputo, you have 6 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Professor Wagner, for being here. I appreciate that. Thank you as well, Mr. Suzley, for being here. There's no disrespect meant to you, Professor Wagner, but I am going to focus my questions to the other witness. That's not to deny your qualifications or insight in any way, shape, or form. Now, Mr. Suzley, just to be clear here, you're representing yourself. You're not representing your union or anything like that. That's correct?
That's correct.
I'm going to run a few scenarios by you, but before we do that, What I'd like to delve into is the culture of the Correctional Service of Canada. Now, the Correctional Service of Canada reports to parliamentarians through the Minister of Justice and is accountable. In fact, we have the Commissioner appear at committee. So when we're talking about misinformation and disinformation, particularly as it relates to parliamentarians, in my view, this is actually quite germane. Would you say that CSE has what I would call, these are my words, a culture of secrecy? What would you say about that?
I think that would be a fair statement to make.
And can you elaborate on what you've seen generally? We don't want you to breach any confidentiality or anything like that. But the culture of secrecy, how does that manifest itself? What are the consequences?
My experience has been that the service is inclined to answer the questions to the bare minimum, to not expose themselves to anything that would portray them in a way that is counter to how they want to be looked at by parliamentarians and by the public.
How do they want to be looked at, in your view, by parliamentarians and the public?
In my view, they want to be regarded as progressive, as I think they would very much prefer, to be honest, to be left out of most any spotlight they can, but certainly to be viewed as a progressive organization that is on the forefront of changing the perception of corrections.
How does CSE deal with anything negative?
In my experience, they don't, or by quickly clamping down on those who are drawing attention to any negativity.
So in those situations, if we as Parliament are trying to evaluate how well our correctional system is operating, I mean, this is just a comment, it seems like we don't get the unvarnished truth. Now, I'm not going to ask you to comment on this specific scenario, but I did some work, and I believe I produced a video on it, wherein the Correctional Service of Canada put out a press release after somebody escaped. And the escape said the person escaped from institutional property. The person was on medium security. For those who don't know, that's 2 very large fences surrounding the institution, the same as maximum, in fact. Very difficult to escape from. And the service put out a bulletin saying he escaped from the grounds of medium security. Sounds fine, right? But the information I had was that this person was actually allowed to be outside the fence. That was a pretty material omission, in my view. If you're going to say someone escaped from medium security, I picture them jumping over 2 razor wire fences that are about 20 feet apart and are about 12 feet high. That's a pretty material omission, kind of like we sometimes see in Parliament, tell half the truth, and that's true. He was on the grounds. Can you comment not specifically on this case, but whether this type of thing is a surprise given your experience?
In my experience, that is absolutely no surprise. Those are more common than I think most people would ever believe.
And would, in that case, this service be trying to, I'm just inferring, that doesn't want to say this person was actually outside of the fence? You don't have to answer that. I'm just saying. It just seems they don't want to acknowledge this person was outside of the perimeter fence and they simply walked away. And yet we as parliamentarians and the public get the half-truth. I also exposed Paul Bernardo and his situation. And I said to the public, and I said very clearly, I came eye to eye with that offender. And CSC came out and were quoted that I had no interactions with that inmate. And yet I hadn't said I had any interactions, but they framed it as though I was lying about it. Does that type of reaction from CSC surprise you, given your experience?
Based on my experience, that doesn't surprise me at all.
Now, needle exchange. Jail has an underground economy. Is that correct?
Yes.
Value, right? Drugs, weapons, any information, cell phones, everything has value. Is that right?
That's correct. It's we phrase it. That's what makes jail go round. Is that underground economy?
Monsieur le Président.
I have just. Oh.
Point d'ordre.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Pardon, Monsieur le Président. J'ai un peu de...
Apologies. I don't see the link to disinformation for parliamentarians here. This seems to be completely off topic. Thank you for your comment, Mr. Villemur. The study is on disinformation and misinformation and the impact on parliamentarians. I believe that Mr. Caputo will bring his questions back to our study.
Go ahead, please.
Candidly, that we're talking about how a government agency communicates with the public and parliamentarians. I don't know what could be more germane to misinformation and disinformation. So I will move forward. The government has spoken with parliamentarians and the public about needle exchanges. What kind of picture have they painted about needle exchanges? And I've got about 10, 20, if you can answer that in about 15 seconds, please.
That it's a harm reduction measure.
What kind of danger are you seeing, and is that being communicated to parliamentarians?
I don't believe that's being accurately communicated at all. The dangers we're seeing is the introduction of weapons into the facilities and the feeding of this underground economy, where we're creating elements to the economy that we haven't dealt with before.
Your retribution.
Mr. Caputo, we're out of time on this round. Ms. Khalid, you have 6 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing today. Professor Wagner, if it's okay, I'll start with you. Perhaps I'm sure you've been studying this for the past couple of years now, and it's been a while where the Conservative Party leader has been attacking mainstream media and journalists with the intention to mislead and make Canadians believe that the news networks they have trusted before for many, many years are no longer trustworthy. Can you perhaps comment on the dangers that this presents to the state of Canada's information ecosystem and to our democracy?
Sure. There's a long line of research in the study of political communication that what researchers call blaming the referees is a strategy often that political elites can use to try to diminish trust in verifiably accurate news sources. And so there's a distinction to be made between news sources that have things like corrections policies and punish journalists when they get facts wrong versus other organizations that also sometimes frame themselves as being news organizations but are primarily opinion organizations. And so when it comes to the more trusted places, the places where they're engaging in what we would think of as more legitimate journalism, which doesn't mean they're always right, but means that they correct themselves when they are wrong. It's a danger to diminish trust in those organizations without evidence, and a lot of times a strategy that political elites use is to try and diminish the amount of trust in mainstream news sources. And the purpose of that diminishing trust is then to not face consequences from voters at the ballot box, as an example, for behaviors lawmakers or others may engage in.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I will tack on the second half of that question to my next question. Now, inflammatory language and material, you spoke about this in your opening remarks as well with respect to emotions getting more engagement than facts. And we've seen dog whistles, et cetera, by political parties generating a lot of engagement. And that engagement does lead to ad revenue as well. So is it fair to say that media platforms are actually benefiting financially when and if they allow this dissemination of mis and disinformation on their platforms?
I think it's fair to say that social media platforms benefit from that, and that some news media platforms benefit from that as well. It partially depends upon the major purpose of the platform and why people use it. And so if it's a place where people are trying to learn what's true, there might not be as much of a financial benefit as for those who might seek out a news source because that source tells them that they are right and the other side is wrong. And so there are advantages to following that kind of model, but not for all media in a blanket way.
I appreciate that. And I'll go back to my original question partly. Say, is there any correlation between a person's distrust of mainstream media sources and their participation in the democratic process? And if so, how?
There is in some ways. And so people who distrust mainstream sources tend to be more supportive of political violence as an avenue to exact political preferences. Many people who are distrustful of mainstream news sources are also highly participatory. And in fact, many people who believe in conspiracy theories are extraordinarily knowledgeable and have very low trust in political institutions like mainstream news media sources or elements of government. And so there are lots of different ways that one's distrust of news could foster participation, sometimes encouraging more violence, but often encouraging more participation in voting, political donations, posting online, things like that.
I appreciate that. Now, I understand, you spoke about this, about the role that the Western social media platforms play. Do you think that there is an obligation on these social media platforms with respect to the algorithms and how information is disseminated, whether it is truthful information or it's misinformation, disinformation, hate speech? Do you think that social media companies have a responsibility to control how those algorithms are impacting what an individual Canadian is seeing within their feed and how it's impacting their participation in the democratic process?
I think that there are responsibilities that social media platforms have when it comes to the unfettered amplification of things that are known to be false. Those can often be very dangerous and have violent consequences or other consequences that might be political consequences but are related to believing in things that are verifiably not true. Much of politics operates in a gray area where some things that are said are true and some things are not, and so it can be dangerous for social media platforms to regulate with too heavy of a hand and stifle speech. But when it comes to de-amplifying statements that are known to be verifiably false, social media platforms have an obligation to, in my view, to not try to share that information widely with their users.
Now, you spoke a little bit about fact checking as a method of controlling misinformation, disinformation, and how it's disseminated. And you also talked about the bias as to who exactly is fact-checking. Now, I've seen, a lot of people, some people, if they're sold on an idea, you Google something, you'll find 20 articles countering your idea. All you need to do is to find that one article to confirm what your belief
Ms. Khalid,
is.
if you can just quick...
Absolutely. How do you think that plays into what kind of regulations and partnerships governments need to have with social media companies in that dissemination of information?
I need a very quick response, please.
That's a very difficult question to answer because it's very difficult to figure out the volume there. And so it's something that platforms need to discuss with regulators, but I don't have a quick answer to that question. I'm sorry to say.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Go ahead.
I'm just wondering that if the witness can perhaps think about it and give a written response to that question.
I'll deal with that at the end of the meeting like we typically do with those requests. On va commencer avec...
We're going to move on to Mr. Villemur for 6 minutes. For the witnesses...
The French translation, please, Monsieur Villemur. Commencez pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being with us. It was a pleasure to hear from you, and it was very interesting. I'll start with Mr. Wagner. Social media, in general, are they cautious of disinformation, or do they simply say that they are? As my colleague mentioned earlier, there's revenue associated with clicks. So is it a surface-level awareness?
At first, I think that they is a term like social media platforms operate really differently. But in general, social media platforms vary in how aggressive they are at de-amplifying false claims, amplifying other kinds of claims. As an example, in the United States, in 2016, a high percentage of things that were not true were exposed to people over Facebook. Facebook was then deeply criticized for that. And in 2020, that percentage dropped precipitously because Facebook engaged in more aggressive diminishment of inauthentic behavior on their platform. And when the criticism died down, they stopped doing that, and that percentage is increasing again. And so they're not static in how they engage in these kinds of behaviors. And it often is in response to criticism and perceptions of potential regulation.
Mais vous avez mentionné un peu plus tôt.
You mentioned earlier that frivolous things might generate more clicks than something more serious. Considering that social media is used less for information and more for enjoying oneself, how can somebody share a serious message when people are mostly using social media for entertainment?
That's a great question. I think a lot of it has to do with the audience individual social media users cultivate. And so most people, I think, cultivate audiences around their interests related to entertainment in some sort of way, or sports or those kinds of things. But others cultivate audiences based upon commenting on public affairs, sharing evidence about politics, or trying to organize and persuade people, or to sow chaos into the social media ecosphere. And so I think it really depends upon what the purpose is to answer that question.
Vous savez que Twitter a un problème au Brésil.
Twitter recently had a problem in Brazil. They were banned and are now back. Did Twitter change anything so that they could operate in Brazil?
I'm not directly aware of changes that Twitter made with respect to what happened to them in Brazil. I can say that in general, they often alter their behaviors in response to governments regulating or fining them.
Donc, comme vous l'affirmiez un peu plus tôt,
As you stated earlier, you shed a light on an issue, they'll work on it while the light is still shining, and then they'll go back to their previous behavior, correct?
That at least happened with Facebook, and we know to some degree that that's happened after the ownership change of Twitter and then the renaming of Twitter to X. There's been a difference in the content moderation behaviors of that platform since then.
pourriez-vous élaborer sur la modération du contenu de X?
Can you talk about the different content moderation of X?
There is far less content moderation. Most of the staff that were doing that were either fired or quit after Twitter was taken over by Mr. Musk. And so part of it is that, but there also still, it's not that there isn't any. There's a feature, I think now it's called Community Notes, that will sometimes append a post. But usually the thing that has to happen to get to that feature being enacted is that multiple sides of a political debate have to agree that the claim is false. And so if one side is pushing a false claim, that's not usually enough to invoke the Community Notes feature.
Est-ce que, en matière de désinformation,
Regarding disinformation, if you had to single out the worst platform, which one would it be?
That's a really hard question. I think probably Truth Social would be, I think, the single worst. There's kind of unfettered access to saying things that aren't true, and very little behavior from the platform that lets the audience know that claims being shared widely are not true.
si je vais exclure pour le moment Truth Social
Let's take Truth Social out of the equation, because that's certain users and not most of the population. Could you identify a platform other than Truth Social?
qui pourrait-on
Who could we identify other than Truth Social as being kind of the worst for disinformation?
It's hard to say with accuracy because we don't know the denominator of how many posts are made on all of the different platforms as compared to how many things aren't true. My impression is that X has now become that leader, but I don't know that as an empirical fact.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Wagner.
Okay,
Thank you, Mr. Wagner. Thank you, Mr. Villemur.
6 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wagner, can you please state your subject matter expertise on this one more time for the record?
Sure. I have a PhD in political science, and I conduct research on individual engagement in information ecologies, and including news, social media, and individual conversation, and look at outcomes related to what people believe to be true, what they want from their government, and how they participate civically and politically.
Mr. Suzeli, can you please state your subject matter expertise on misinformation and disinformation?
I'll state my experience as a correctional officer since 2007 within the federal penitentiary system.
So no subject matter expertise on misinformation. Okay. Mr. Wagner, with that being said, who are the primary actors spreading misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation? And I know you're coming from an American context, but perhaps you might have some insight into the Canadian political system.
A lot of mis and disinformation that is shared in Western democracies originates from Russian sources in the IRA, Internet Research Agency, and other bot farms in different parts of Europe that exist to kind of sow false claims and try and spread them. In the American context, a key spreader of misinformation that also gets a lot of attention is the former president, Donald Trump, as in terms of an account that spreads a lot of misinformation. But I would say, the primary organization that is really attempting to influence elections in Canada, in the United States, is the Russian IRA.
And are certain parliamentarians more at risk than others in being targeted and affected by disinformation campaigns?
It seems to be that the IRA or the Russian government has candidates they would prefer to see win elections and candidates they would prefer to see lose elections, and so those they would prefer to see lose tend to be more in the to have a greater likelihood of being targeted with negative information. Although sometimes candidates in different parties get positive and negative information from these agencies as an effort to just sow chaos and be confusing, which is often one of the objectives of this kind of organization.
Is it fair to say that this goes well beyond Russia? Because, I would put to you that it's been my experience, we love to oversimplify this as Russian, Chinese, maybe Indian sometimes. But is it not fair to say that there are various state-sponsored internet propaganda machines that are used to spread this? And, I would reference Operation Earnest Voice, and, in the United States of America. I would reference, you talked about Donald Trump. Obviously, the United States was a prime propagator of the Chinese virus during COVID and a lot of vaccine misinformation, disinformation. There are allies such as so-called allies such as Israel with the Hasbara. They have a whole ministry of strategic affairs that deals with targeting political actors. And I know that that's kind of come out in the United States. So can you maybe just take a step back and zoom back and talk a little bit more beyond Russia in terms of the state-sponsored internet propaganda machines that are out there?
There are lots of state-sponsored efforts to try and influence elections in other countries and in their own countries. There are lots of non-state sponsored organizations that also are trying to do the same and do so by trying to spread mis and disinformation. So yeah, it's certainly not any one actor. If asked to name the primary one, I would say Russia, as I was asked earlier. But in general, there are as many opportunities as there are users of the internet in some respects.
What advice would you have, if any, on us dealing with attempts or times or scenarios that become prevalent when our so-called allies are actively engaged in presenting misinformation and disinformation? Do you view it as a national security threat when foreign state actors are actively engaged in spreading disinformation and misinformation?
That's outside my area of expertise, but I, as a citizen worry about how state-sponsored mis and disinformation from or toward allies or adversaries. I think I worry about all of it, and so it's certainly something that, in my view, governments should be talking with each other about, and also parliamentarians should be talking with their constituents about.
In terms of a risk assessment in national security, how high would you put misinformation and disinformation as being a threat to free and fair elections when it comes to Western democracies?
Much higher than it used to be, at least in the United States context. Mis and disinformation on social media platforms has been tied to encouraging the January 6th atrocities at the United States Capitol as an example of how mis and disinformation about the results of an election can foment political violence. There's also a high number of mis and disinformation behaviors that occur around elections, trying to target particular populations, telling them the wrong day for an election, or telling them rules about what they have to do when they vote that aren't accurate, and those sorts of things. And so those are all dangers to free and fair elections.
Mr. Chair, how much time do I have left?
You're out of time, Mr. Green. Okay,
Geez. We'll get you on the next round.
So that concludes our first round. We are going to have 2 5-minute rounds and a 2.5-minute round, and that'll conclude our first panel. We want to try to keep it on time here. I'm going to go back to Mr. Caputo for 5 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Susley, before I begin, this idea of expertise is an interesting one because sometimes we have, and people can chuckle, but sometimes we have okay, I apologize. I thought that it was a tuckle to my question. People can have different views on expertise, but in my view, 17 years of real-world expertise or real-world knowledge is highly beneficial to this committee. So I thank you for being here. Sir, do you fear any repercussions for what you are saying to this committee here?
I do.
Do you feel fear, I should say?
Yeah, I anticipate some kind of punitive response to this.
Would you be prepared to let this committee know if there is any sort of response or follow from your testimony here today, given that you were invited by parliamentarians and are simply answering questions from parliamentarians truthfully?
I have no concern with doing that.
I'm going to ask you about gangs in jail and how it's communicated to the public and parliamentarians by the CSC and what's really happening. Do you have any comment on gangs in jail and how that's being communicated and what's really going on?
The CSC prides themselves in having successfully eliminated gangs out of Canadian prisons a number of years ago. I believe it was 2014, 2015. That is a celebrated accomplishment amongst the brass of the CSC, which was accomplished by changing the name of gangs to security threat groups.
What does that mean? Security threat groups? Was it simply just a change in the name, and therefore we say no gangs exist? Do I have that right?
Yes, it was a name change that out of one side of the mouth eliminated gangs, and on the other hand created a very new problem with a very newly named group.
Somebody was to testify before Parliament and say, gangs are not an issue, but we didn't know this, and we have to say security threat groups are. That's certainly misleading in my view. I want you to talk as well about, we are told that in corrections there's safe, secure, humane control, and people are transferred in consistent, when I say transferred down security from maximum to medium to minimum, in accordance with their risk to public safety and things like that. Do you have any comment on that, sir?
That's a very hot issue amongst correctional officers about what we perceive and believe is the inaccurate security classification of inmates being inappropriately downgraded or downgraded through security levels without the outside of where that inmate is fit to be operating in. When we have a maximum security inmate positioned into a medium or minimum security environment, of course, that produces all kinds of threats to us and to the public.
And is the public, is this type of thing routinely communicated to parliamentarians and the public?
It's very rarely communicated to anyone internally. I would be shocked if it was communicated externally at all. It's usually done through the form of what's called overrides.
Overrides, okay. What's an override is when a manager essentially says, I disagree with what the computer has spit out and I'm going to change that on my own. That's a kind of crude way of putting it. Is that accurate?
Essentially.
How much time do I have, Mr. Chair, please?
A minute and 10 seconds.
Okay, in a minute and 10 seconds, when somebody's incarcerated, there's a perception that this person is especially in medium and maximum, but people perceive minimum, which has no fences, that people are behind fences. Are there times where people have work clearances or unofficially are escorted out of jails in your experience, contrary to policy, and is that ever communicated?
Absolutely, that happens on an extremely, I would suggest, daily basis in most institutions across the country.
You describe, without breaching any confidentiality or anything like that, describe a scenario that is common knowledge to somebody in your industry?
We have inmates serving life sentences who are not eligible for any forms of parole, but are given gate or fence clearance to work off site and not out of perimeter during the business day.
Communicated to the public or parliamentarians in annual reports or anything like that?
No, not communicated anywhere.
I assume that's my time, Mr. Chair.
It's close to it. Thank you, Mr. Caputo. Ms. Shanahan for 5. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I thank the witnesses for being here today. Professor Wagner, I find it very interesting, the remarks that you've made, and the fact that you have been you have been undertaking research in this area, which, we must admit is fairly new. So I know that you've co-written and published a paper in July 2024 entitled Slant, Extremity, and Diversity, How the Shape of News Use Explains Electoral Judgments and Confidence. And it introduces measures that captures individuals' partisan slant, partisan extremity, and overall diversity of news media used to understand how people interact with contemporary news ecology. Now, one of the conclusions, and I don't pretend to have read this paper, but our analysts have, and I thank them for this question. One of the conclusions in this paper is that a diverse news consumption style can moderate misinformation beliefs. Now, what do you mean by that? What is a diverse news consumption style?
So thank you for the question. A diverse news consumption style is using a wide range of sources, oftentimes some of which will include sources that tend to favor a political ideology other than that of the individual of interest. And so that would be, a liberal who also gets some news from conservative outlets, a conservative who also gets some news from liberal outlets, but also, engages in a higher number of sources to learn from rather than a smaller number. So both the volume and the diversity, and then the slant, the direction of the information from a political perspective.
Okay, so when you mean diversity, it's actually in points of view, because I was wondering if it actually had to do with types of media, just knowing that watching television news, for example, very different experience from looking at Facebook news. Would that's a diversity that's important?
So in that particular paper, we don't use social media because that social media aren't news sources. They don't produce news in the way that a journalist does. They share news, and a lot of what gets shared on social media are links to news. But in that particular paper, it's looking at news sources, print, broadcast, digital, radio, those kinds of sources. And there's some evidence that different sources have different, like broadcast news, broadcast television tends to help those with less education learn more about politics, whereas newspapers tend to help, and digital news tends to help folks with more education learn about politics. So there are some differences in how people benefit from the different sources they might consume.
Professor, help me out here, because so when we think about different news sources and that they would have different points of view, you know, I consider myself a well-read person. I consume a lot of news, and you know, I would think that I don't know, CNN is considered what, liberal? Washington Post, I don't know. CTV, I would have considered conservative, but now apparently it's liberal. Like, how do we identify, or is that even useful to be identifying different news sources that way?
It's a real challenge, and any way that anyone, including myself, makes those labels is open to criticism. So one strategy is to use what we did in that paper, which is a set of scores called the Ferris scores that array news sources based upon the ideological orientation of their users. And so that is one way to measure how liberal or conservative or centrist a source might be. Another would be to compare the kinds of sources that news organizations quote with the kind of sources that lawmakers of different political parties quote, and look for correspondence between those. And so if a newspaper quoted sources that more liberal parliamentarians refer to in speeches, that might be an example of that paper being more liberal, and another, you know, and vice versa. But all of these, of course, have their problems. None of them are infallible.
Recommendation before my time is over on what you would consider the most well-balanced news sources or credible news sources?
I would say often sources that are public sponsored. So the United States, like National Public Radio and public television, as an example, the BBC as another. These are often high-quality news sources. It's also the case, though, you know, that any government-sponsored source does run the danger of bias that might favor the government since they are signing the checks.
Okay.
At your next study.
Thank you, Ms. Shanahan. Monsieur Villemure, pour 2 minutes 30 secondes, s'il vous plaît.
For 2.5 minutes, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Wagner, I'll come back to you. We've gotten used to living with things that are false or untrue. And there are people who create news. Is it too late to counter disinformation?
I don't think it's too late. I think there are among the fastest growing legitimate news sources in the West are fact-checking news organizations. So there is an audience for reporting that does more than just say, here's what our leaders said, but says, were these things verifiably accurate, and how do we know that or not? And so I don't think it's too late, but it's definitely an uphill battle.
D'accord.
To your knowledge, do you believe that Canadian legislation is strong enough to counter disinformation?
I am sadly not enough of an area expert to speak to that. I wish I could, but that's not my area of expertise.
Alors, est-ce que vous auriez une...
Would you have a recommendation on what it would be important to act on as quickly as possible?
I think information that's time dependent. And so, you know, when there is a natural disaster and there's dis or misinformation about government response to it, when there is an election where the time to vote ends at a certain time and there's mis or disinformation floating around, I think things with a time deadline, I think, are probably the most important to engage in action about.
De votre point de vue de scientifique.
As a political scientist, is it strange that we hear talk about lies every day and that we simply accept that people brazenly lie with no consequences? Does that have an impact on democracy?
I think that it does. most folks don't know very much about what's going on in their country and around the world. And most people don't wake up and ask themselves, how do they hold their government accountable today? What instead, they rely upon legitimate sources of information to create penalties for lying, penalties such as not being reelected, censure or sanction from their colleagues, a public embarrassment for things that they say that are not true. And we see a decrease in many Western countries with respect to those kinds of behaviors, both from lawmakers and from news organizations in some respects over time. And we see as societies polarize and divide, we see an increasing willingness of people to forgive the sins of their side and focus on the sins of the other side.
Okay. Merci. Merci, Monsieur Villemure. Mr. Green, 2.5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to be able to explore some of those concepts, perhaps in English, for the good and welfare of the people that are watching, because we have had several witnesses appear before this committee in the context of the study to talk about misinformation and disinformation and how it can negatively impact Canadians' trust in public institutions. So the current information ecosystem has been seeing an erosion in trust that some people have as well in traditional media. And obviously the same impacts are happening in the States. So have you done research on the impact of misinformation and disinformation on public trust in institutions and traditional media?
Yes, but not in Canada.
What are the main takeaways from the American example that we might be able to learn from?
One is that when ideological sources attack the referees, which is to say attack legitimate news sources time and time again, and then want to rely upon those sources to fact check things that they care about, they learn quickly that their audience no longer trusts them. And so we've seen very prominent people who've engaged in kind of polarized communication on talk radio and cable television in the United States sow distrust in legitimate news sources. And then when a candidate came along of their own party that they didn't like, and they told their audience, we can't trust this person because they lie all the time, their audience said, but you told us not to trust these sources. And so when there are no referees, it's very difficult to maintain the integrity of a game or integrity of politics.
In terms of ideological ecosystems, we know that in that continuum, it ends in a place of ideologically motivated violent extremism. We know that in the States, or at least it's been reported, and I'll leave it to you to comment as a subject matter expert, that the 2 attempts on Donald Trump's life were in fact from ideologically motivated right-wing extremists. Is that not correct?
I'm confident that at least one of those is correct, and I believe that the most recent reporting I've seen is consistent with your characterization.
And so in that space, you quite rightly identify that when this ecosystem of violence, political violence, is unleashed in a world that is absent of fact and completely disassociated from basic civil norms, political violence will impact everybody. Is that a safe assumption to make?
It certainly could, and it's the case that individuals feel it in survey research that we do when we ask those who don't participate in politics why they don't. A non-trivial percentage say it's because there are too many dangerous people out there who, are often believing some of the things that you're talking about with respect to things that aren't true that can often lead to political violence.
Okay. So in short, that undermines democracy at its foundation if people don't even want to engage because they're afraid of ideologically violent people.
You can't have a free and fair election if everyone doesn't feel safe to participate.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Green. Thank you, Mr. Wagner. I want to thank you and Mr. Suzla for being here today. That concludes our first panel. And going back to what Ms. Khalid had said earlier,